It's to be anticipated that a public figure must at some point confront the contradictory nature of widespread admiration and condemnation. This is especially true when exposing the duplicitous nature of institutions and government powers. This is familiar territory for writer and activist Arundhati Roy, as is evident in her books and essays, including 1997's Booker Prize-winning novel, The God of Small Things. Roy has a remarkable talent for laying bare the inner workings of systems of injustice within socio-political structures. To understand an issue and reveal it to an audience with such rage, energy, passion, and eloquence is in part what makes Roy so significant in the political and literary spheres. While criticized and threatened by many of India's right-leaning, she is simultaneously revered in India and across the globe for her intellectual honesty and alertness to fascism, racism, classism, war, nuclear weaponry, the caste system, environmental destruction, religious discrimination and violence, and so much more. Which is why it's so well deserved that she's being honored with the 2022 St. Louis Literary Award. While visiting St. Louis to receive the award and take part in the ceremony in her honor, I had the privilege of sitting down with her and discussing her journey and experience as a writer of such esteem. Congratulations, Arundhati Roy. Ms. Roy, thank you so much for sitting down with us today.
Oh, you're so welcome. It's my pleasure.
You are considered one of the most important writers of our time. You've received so many awards, including the Booker Prize, and now you're here in St. Louis to receive the St. Louis Literary Award, which congratulations for that. But as you've said so many times before, you don't write for accolades or recognition. You're clearly writing with a purpose and a point. I'm wondering if you ever take a step back and look at all the work that you've done and the impact that you've had and really feel it. How does that feel?
Well, look, when you sort of introduce a writer, you tend to, make a list of all the prizes they've won, but that's just one side of the story for me, because mostly it's been writing that has been written at a time of conflict, at a time when the country I live in, the society I live in, is being torn apart, where one struggles to search for forms, literary forms, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, to tell the stories that one wants to tell or make the arguments one wants to make. And sometimes, I've never been a person who wants to be sort of introduced by the awards I've won, but sometimes for us, for people like me, living in the space that I live in and the time that I live in, an award is also a protection of a kind, So it's a very complicated river that I swim in. So the body of work is something that is not something that one looks back and necessarily to feel good about oneself, but it all informs what you do next and how you do it and what is the next layer that you add to it. And it's about understanding the world I live in. I write not to have an impact on other people, but to understand for myself where I live, how I fit in, and to communicate a worldview that is not mine alone. So it's very interesting. As a writer, you are alone, and yet you don't want to separate yourself from your people or from people in the world, whether you agree with them, disagree with them. You're a fish that swims in that river along with everybody else.
You have a background in filmmaking and you studied architecture. What is it about writing that felt like the most adequate way to say the things you want to say?
Well, I grew up in a very small place on the banks of a river, And I used to think so much about the Mississippi when I was growing up on the banks of my small river. But I studied architecture partially because I left home when I was very young, and I really needed to be independent. I knew, because I somehow sensed from a very young age that I could not expect social or family support for the ways in which I think or act. But then architecture became a very deep foundation and a fascination, not just in the building of buildings, but just in a way to think, And soon after I graduated, I actually got involved with cinema, where again, there was the use of architecture, because I would design the films that I wrote or sometimes have acted in. And all of it together became very fundamental to the ways in which, or the lens through which I would try to understand how the world works. But I think fundamentally, even from the time I was very young, I knew that I was a loner and that I needed to work in ways in which I could control my work, and that's not the reason I'm a writer. The reason I'm a writer is because I think the reason musicians are musicians, or basketball players are basketball players, is something deeper which you can't understand. But for me, the idea that in a capitalist world, in a world where so much of your art forms are now so dependent on what capital you have access to. For me, writing is that singular way of it being between yourself and your work before the world comes in and negotiates.
I'm just wondering if you have any wisdom for especially young people who understand their place and their own responsibilities, but also the fact that they're one person, and there's so much beyond them that maybe is out of their control.
Especially for me, in order to be a writer, I knew that I have to be as independent as possible. It's almost like being a guerrilla, like in the ways in which I have had to do my writing. It's like an intellectual ambush, and then move out and hold your peace for a while, think about things. And also the independence from institutions, for me, was lucky, because I wrote a book which made me financially independent. Everybody cannot expect that to happen to them. It was very fortunate. But I do know that many of the things that I have written, I would not have been allowed to write were I inside an institution, I'm referring specifically to a small book I wrote called The Doctor and the Saint, which was about Gandhi and Ambedkar and their debates about caste, about race, about women, about the working class. And it's just simply not allowed, especially not in India. If you were in an institutional space, you would have suffered greatly for writing that, because there's so much intellectual dishonesty, there's so much falsehood, there's so much literally intellectual real estate built upon those false things that you really can't mess with it if you're inside the system. This is not to say that you can't do something if you're not entirely independent, but to be as independent as possible, I would say the fundamental thing which human beings are not taught is that you must value that independence more than you value wealth or fame. And so it's a constant calibration, a constant titration of what to walk away from and what to embrace, which is not to say you have to live in a cave and be an ascetic, but how do you negotiate that moment when you have been bought over.
You also include a lot of humor in your writing. It's very funny to read your work at times, and I'm wondering how important it is to you to maintain a level of humor in the world and also in your writing.
Well, it's not something one consciously maintains, it's just something that one is. And I know that living in India, despite the fact that I write about the things I write about, and the Hindu right constantly accuses me of hating India and being anti-India, in truth, I love living there. And every day something on the street makes me burst out laughing, and I think especially because as a woman, one has been sort of, not me personally because I have a crazy mother, but generally women in India are so indoctrinated to be the one that sacrifices, the one that suffers, the one that lays oneself down as a doormat. And for me, part of the battle of surviving as a woman in India has been to laugh, and it's a militant laugh that I have, that is like, you're not going to take away that from me. The idea that I'm going to just fight these battles and suffer and be a martyr and be quivering with moral outrage, that's not me. We're going to have fun while we're doing it. We're going to pursue art. We're going to find the things you do ridiculous, because that too is a part of a political lens,
Both The God of Small Things and The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, while they're very different in story and structure and approach, they're so similarly complex and layered, and you are crossing so many timelines and through so many different minds, and you find this magical way to converge these individuals into a larger connected story, which ultimately reflects the way that the world works. And I want to know how one goes about beginning that process and mapping out a story of such scale.
Like I often say that the God of Small Things, it's like a family with a broken heart at its center. And while it's a extraordinarily unfamily-like family, at least you recognize the contours of a family. The utmost happiness sort of starts out with a shattered heart, and then people bring these shards of their broken hearts into a graveyard and make a mended heart, But to me, that is the excitement of writing a novel, that you can sort of range over so many things and so many times without overt judgment, and yet obviously no writer can hide their worldview from the glare of literature. Even a bad writer can't, So it's that is the challenge for me, and I think maybe that is where architecture and urban planning come in, because the novel, how it's structured, how the language that it uses, the characters and the story are all one thing, and each has to be as complex as the other. I'm that sort of novelist, which is why I can't write, a novel a year or a novel every 2 years, because nothing makes me happier than living inside my novels while I'm writing them, And it's almost as if the Ministry of Utmost Happiness gave me a world to live in, a world which exists for real in the real world, but it just tells you there are different ways of relating to each other than what the prescription says,
When you were writing fiction, you're getting to know these characters, you're living in that world, as you say. Do you go into fiction writing with the intent to make a political statement, or does that naturally just kind of come as you go?
I don't think that I can go into the kind of fiction I write with any simple intent. But I know that, whoever I am will manifest itself in that, whatever my intent is or isn't, because as we all know, even a fairy tale is a political document, but I think in fiction, for example, in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, one of the most challenging parts for me was to write this character called Biplab Das Gupta, whose college friends call him Garson Hobart, and he's this very upper caste, a very brilliant Indian intelligence officer who's kind of fused with the establishment, and in some ways completely antithetical to me, except that when I wrote him, I really respected his intelligence. It was not good enough for me to make him easy meat, or to just just to minimize him, to show how ridiculous my enemy is. To respect one's enemy is important, and so it was like going out of your mind, creating this character, who was in some ways your intellectual equal, but on the other side.
He's also the only character written in first person, I noticed.
Yes, because he just, it was just very interesting. Perhaps the authority of the state, gave him that authority, and I tried to stop that, but it just didn't happen.
What distinguishes the motive to write fiction versus writing an essay? When you get the seed of an idea, how does that direct itself into either direction?
Well, it's very different for me in terms of urgency. Somehow most, not all, but most of my nonfiction, there's a sort of urgency to it. Surfaces because this curiosity I spoke about earlier that takes you to places and that sort of settles a kind of understanding on you, and then at some point you have to blow open the consensus that is being built because otherwise. But in fiction, there's no urgency. I mean, almost to a ridiculous degree. It took me 20 years to write the second novel. I mean, I was working on the Ministry for years and years, but I was just happy to weave it in my own time, in the character's own time, actually. It was almost like I needed to know them for a lifetime. I needed to know what they would be like, even outside of the novel, I mean, I need to know what they're thinking of St. Louis now, So it's like you're creating, as I said, a universe where you're using what exists, and I don't mean this in a, crass sense, because what exists also is our imaginations in this world and in this time, our hallucination, all of that. But creating a universe which is almost like parallel to the one that exists on the ground, the grids, the social hierarchies, the things that we are tutored to function within, but presenting a different way of doing that.
In the 20 years that it took you to write The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, did you feel any pressure to make it the same as The God of Small Things, or to surpass it in some way?
Well, I had definitely, the one pressure I felt was not to repeat The God of Small Things, I thought the opposite, that since I had done that and I certainly didn't want to write The Son of the God of Small Things, The God of Small Things gave me the opportunity to experiment, to write a more complex. I mean, I knew that it was a much more difficult book that I was doing, and it was certainly not going to sort of walk up to people and sit and embrace them like the God of Small Things does or did, And of course, I was, that much older, lived those many more years. And so the excitement was in trying to do something else. And I didn't feel pressure because I think when you have had an experience like the success and the immediate success of the God of Small Things, you can either use it to torment yourself or to liberate yourself, And it liberated me in so many ways, not just artistically, but financially and politically. And so to me, it just gave me freedom and to try something different and something else. And yet, when you read the ministry, you will see so many echoes of the God of Small Things, which is just fun for me.
You're known in part for your ability to be blunt and confrontational and to say things that need to be said. But are you ever, or have you ever been hesitant or fearful before coming out with a truth?
I think a lot before I say the things I say, because every sentence, every comma, every semicolon, every pause is examined and fired upon and argued over. So in this moment in India where there's so much danger, all my friends, so many of my friends are in jail. Even when I'm here, I'm reading about another friend being arrested. And, so I can never be a fan of being uncertain or being confident. One has to think very carefully about saying things, and then you can say them with confidence once you've thought it through, But I love uncertainty, I love ambiguity. It's not that I have some sledgehammer with which I want to come down on things. So even the things that I say with certainty will be said after having taken into account the complexities, the uncertainties, the ambiguities. Because sometimes, having taken those things into account, you still must pick a side, Otherwise, you are cowardly. Often, something happens and I am enraged about it, and I will write. And then I have close friends who are my rage editors who will be like, calm down,
You write in such a cinematic way. It's clear that your experience with filmmaking has had some kind of effect on the way that you write. But the scenes that you describe are so vivid and so visually and auditorily supplemented. And I'm wondering if you can picture your books being adapted into films.
Well, it's funny that you ask, because when I started writing The God of Small Things, I used to think I'm going to write this stubbornly visual but unfilmable book, because I felt limited when I was writing screenplay, Exterior Day River. And I was like, no, I want to spend 2 pages describing the river, which mean nothing in cinema writing, But of course, I've had many offers to turn The God of Small Things and even the ministry into film. But I think that they are exactly in the form in which they should be. I know, when, at some stage when I'm not around and, copyright doesn't exist, maybe they will be made into film. But for me, a film then makes my books, into one thing, whereas actually every reader has a film in their head, I think. And so a film might be beautiful, but it might colonize it,
It's more free to be
Yeah,
what it's
people
meant to.
can imagine, It's like, I don't know if you remember, but there's a description in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness about this little shrine called Hazrat Sarmat Sheikh shrine in the Jama Masjid. It was the shrine to an Armenian Jewish poet who came to India from Armenia, then converted to Islam, then renounced it, and then was executed. It's a small shrine, and all kinds of people go there, and everyone is allowed to make their own story about him, and that's such a beautiful thing, to let people imagine things rather than imagine it in specific ways. Cinema is such an overpowering medium, and I like these novels to belong to the reader and not to the filmmaker.
What are you currently working on?
Currently working on nothing, because I am currently living in a situation in India which has turned so dangerous that I'm just trying to think of how to live in it. It's like watching something just come apart, and as a writer, I'm struggling to find. It's almost like every day you wake up, something new, something terrible. Someone's been lynched, someone's been killed, massacres. Right now I just got a message about how the current establishment, Hindu, right-wing, anti-Islam, has decided that they're just bulldozing Muslim neighborhoods. There's been mass killing in my city. So, to step back from that and really build a piece of literature is difficult. They have this new citizenship law where already 2 million people who have lived in India for generations have been struck off. So it's not a refugee management policy, but a refugee manufacturing policy. And now they're talking about starting, and this is just in one state. There are 28 states in India. Now there's talk of starting a new process of verification where they already stating that their goal is to strike 5 million Muslims off the list of citizenship, which means you have no rights, you are nobody. They are building huge detention centers. So where does one find, even a part of the river where there isn't a fast current to sit and think? It's really difficult. But it'll happen, but you have to just know how not to react to every moment and every little new piece of news that comes in, but you have to react,
How do you remain hopeful?
Well, you have to understand that is the building block of resistance, If they get you to lose hope, if they get you to lose joy, if they get you to lose entirely your peace of mind, your ability to love, your ability to focus on small things, then they've won, So even, as I've said, in the most despairing situations, I have found, hope and love and an ability to say, anyway, whatever you want to do to us, we're never going to be on your side. We're here and we're doing our work, and whether we win or lose, we're here. So it's not even a question of whether you have hope or not. Even if you don't have hope, you're going to do what you're going to do,
Well, thank you so much for sitting down with me.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was a pleasure talking to you.